Tommy, thanks for joining me today. And
Thank you for having me.
you have a Instagram.
I do.
You want to tell me about it?
Yes, I do. I am a big history lover of the Chicago outfit, criminal organization of the past. My Instagram, I have an Instagram account dedicated to it. It's called @Chicago_Ganglands_history, Chicago Gangland History on Instagram. And yeah, I just love tracing this history when it comes to Al Capone era, which is Prohibition, even up until the 2000s, the Family Secrets trial, when a bunch of big name gangsters went to jail.
And you've got a connection to Mokena. You grew up there.
Yes, my family moved to Mokena in 1992, and we lived over in the Willow and Fiona area, kind of closer to Route 45, side of Mokena. And we moved in 1992. My parents still live in Mokena. So I have a lot of history in Mokena as well.
So I got an email, and it was Tommy said that there's a kind of a mob connection for Mokena.
It's very true. So for some odd reason that we're trying to figure out, a gangster by the name of Dominic Tootsie Palermo. Tootsie was his nickname. Not sure why he got that nickname. But Dominic Palermo and his wife are buried in St. John's Cemetery off of Wolf Road.
So we thought it'd be a cool idea to kind of tell a little bit of his story. There's not a ton of his story available, as we've been talking, and that realized that the kind of South Cook, Lake County, Indiana mob or organized crime was very quiet and kept their heads kind of low.
Yeah, they found out, because none of these guys wanted to go to jail. Obviously, there were some mobsters like Al Capone who were very flashy. They were in the newspapers all the time. These guys in the South Suburbs, Chicago Heights, even parts of Indiana, they kind of took the Tony Accardo way, I guess. Tony Accardo was boss for years, and he kept a low profile. So all these guys kept low profiles. So we know what we know about these Chicago Heights specific gangsters, but there's a lot that we don't really know. And I like to get my info from the Tribune archives, just the newspapers archives, and that's where you can get most of the most solid information.
For the gangs in the South Chicago area, what was their major crime? What was the prominent thing they were getting in trouble for?
So Chicago Heights gangster history goes back into Prohibition, even before 1919, 1920. There were gangs, and once Prohibition happened, they just like any other gangster, they took advantage of a need, and that need was to produce alcohol. So Chicago Heights in the beginning, they were really into bootlegging. It was a real big bootlegging town. They had people making bathtub gin in their houses, small things like that, to big stills concealed in warehouses, because there was a lot of industry warehouses in Chicago Heights. So, and of course, these bootleggers took control of the local government, which meant they could operate and make booze. So they started out as bootleggers, and there was a couple different bootlegging gangs in Chicago Heights at the time, and eventually in about 1926 they just forged together and forged gangs and were like, let's make some money and try not to kill each other. So
and we're heading out to the our first stop. I think we're going to go by South Holland. And were those areas really connected? South Holland, Calumet City, Chicago Heights? Yeah,
it was mostly Chicago Heights who fell under the fold of the Capone gang in the early days and later into the Chicago outfit. And South Holland, Calumet City, even like Burnham, which is just right over the border in Indiana, has early Prohibition history as well. But it usually when the outfit controls a town or a small city, they usually control the neighboring towns along with it. You know, they don't just center on Chicago Heights. It'll be just the towns around it. And South Holland is near Calumet City, which is near Chicago Heights.
Now, South Holland, I think Tootsie originally did live in Calumet City at a point. Is that right? Or are we always, the first point is
it's his
South Holland?
South Holland address is the only one I have found, and then later the Orland Park mystery. But the South Holland, I know he was at least there in the 60s.
And as we're going to go by in part of this, we're going to see where his businesses were on the famous Sin Strip of Calumet City.
Yeah, it was just like a 2-3 block on State Street in Calumet City. It was a 2 to 3 block area where it was just nothing but taverns, go-go dancers. You know, the outfit had their stronghold on prostitution, gambling. All these taverns had gambling in them, and of course, gambling was illegal back then. So they had their different, like in Cicero, they had a little Sin Strip in Cicero too.
Okay.
They had the one in Calumet City. They tried to control River Road. They tried to control River Road by O'Hare Airport and tried to make it kind of a Sin City area, but they didn't really succeed in that.
And one thing with the Sin Strip I thought was really interesting is a video you shared with me with the former mayor, was it Jerry Genova?
Yeah, I believe he was mayor from 93 to the early 2000s.
And he, you know, Tommy shared a great video with me about him, you know, being a fighter for change, and he tore down a lot of the buildings in Calumet City that were prostitution was rampant and things like that.
Yeah, it developed quite a bad reputation into the 90s.
And then, sure enough, he himself was convicted on extortion or taking money. He took $125,000.
That's Illinois
in bribes.
for you.
I mean, you know, this area has been, and as we drive through, you see it still is a really rough area throughout. And is that the effect of a lot of this corruption over the years?
Sure. I mean, Cicero, for example, ever since the Capone gang moved into Cicero in the mid-20s, I think just Cicero has just always had kind of a bad reputation, just known as kind of like a dangerous area, and I think that influence of them moving all those years ago kind of put it on Cicero.
And you lose, you know, there's a bad part of it, but you lose some of that, what those people brought to the community, which was business owners felt safe because they had a protection, or felt safe as long as they paid their money.
As long as they paid the street tax.
Exactly, or did whatever was told or asked of them.
Yeah.
But there was that mass, there was a huge effort to get rid of crime in the 90s. And at the same time, you see a lot of these cities and towns, Chicago Heights, were just decimated.
Yeah, it's one of those things. It's like, the history gets torn down and it becomes like an open lot. And when I trace this history, gangster, history and stuff, to locations and stuff, and there's still a building there, I'm like, oh, great.
Yeah.
And then we'll see if it's like the original building, but most of my research goes to empty parking lots.
That's unfortunate.
But it's fine.
I think we found one though that we're gonna get to see at least.
We did.
The outside,
it's where,
cool.
where the FBI bugged Tootsie.
So we're gonna go to Tootsie's South Holland home.
Yes, and I believe he lived at this location 60s to the 80s before he went to jail.
Okay.
So we're gonna go to his, and this is heavily in the newspaper archives. This address is all over the old newspapers of the day that he lived here.
And he was living here while he was running his restaurants on
Cal City, yeah,
as well as really becoming an up and comer within the local mob.
Yeah, his main thing was he was a professional bully. He threatened violence to people to pay him for protection. He also was a loan shark. He put money out on the street. He was into gambling in every sort of which way, and he helped make a lot of money for the outfit at the time.
And you mentioned gambling, and it's interesting because now we're in a time where gambling is legalized, alcohol is legalized, but at different times, those two were major factors of organized crime.
Yeah.
And put a lot of people in prison. So they're sitting back going, what the heck? You know?
And a lot of people ask me, is it still around today? And it's really hard to say. I think like with all modern technology and everything, it's pretty much decimated. Yeah, but the Heights, those guys, they started with bootlegging. They went into gambling, prostitution.
Now, were drugs a thing then?
Drugs, it's hard to say with Chicago. New York, Mafia, they were big no-no on drugs. Some guys sold drugs really low-key, and some got killed for it. But in Chicago, drugs were of course they were a thing. These guys like to make money any illegal way they could. So some guys didn't listen to direct orders and sold drugs, even though it's highly frowned upon, because if you got caught selling drugs, that means a long prison sentence, and the bosses thought you would flip.
Sure. Well, that was the Goodfellas story, right?
Yep. Yeah, same thing in Chicago. Like, these guys all lived by a code where you don't talk about your criminal activities, and if you did, you were killed. All right, let's go to Tootsie Palermo's house when he was heavily involved in the Chicago Heights rackets. These rackets included gambling, prostitution, even murder, whatever made these guys money.
And there's also the perception, though, a lot of people have, that a lot of these mobsters were known by everybody. They kind of were the glad handers, but I guess, we don't know. If Tootsie he must have had a, personality that was able to win people over too.
Apparently, I read somewhere that his attorney just said he was a really grandfatherly, soft-spoken guy,
And how was it that most people, I guess we don't really know with Tootsie, but most people made their way into the life of crime or the mafia?
Everyone rose up the ladder in their own way. Like Sam Giancana rose. He started off as a wheelman because he was a good driver. So he started off that way. A lot of these guys
usually young. Like, are they really young?
Yeah. They all kind of differed, but young. And a lot of them started off as like burglars, really petty crime, and they just either their parents hung around gangsters, or they just grew up in the area that these gangsters were in. And it's that old time thing of a young kid sees these guys dressed in nice suits, driving cool cars. I want to be that, So they try to befriend these people, and they just get sucked into the organization. And if you can make money for the mob, the risk too if you mess up.
Yeah.
All right.
It was right on that curve. Right?
Yeah, right on the curve. Yeah. So Tootsie Palermo lived up here for a long time. Certainly before he went to jail for extortion in 1992.
So I think we're talking this one on the...
This one, the side here.
I might swoop back around and get a better view of it.
We can check it out on this side. Oh, yeah.
too suspicious here either.
Yeah. I don't know.
Oh, that's good. Talk a little bit about the structure. And so say the time, where Sin Strip is going on, he's kind of starting to come up. What was, before he's boss, what was kind of the Mafia structure for the area at the time?
Tony Accardo was the top boss, and then usually these hierarchies it goes like boss, underboss, consigliere. So like 3 top guys, pretty much. And then underneath you have your capo regimes, your capos. These guys are head of specific crews in Chicago. So at the time, in the 60s and 70s, a guy by the name of Al Pilato was kind of the top boss of the Chicago Heights crew. And he had a guy named El Taco under him, but at the time Al Pilato was pretty much head boss. Or El Pilato, yes, El Pilato. And El Pilato, he was also the head of the laborers union at the time, and his brother was the chief of police in Chicago Heights.
Oh, okay.
So he was able to operate illegal activity no problem. But he got, later on he got caught, obviously stealing from the laborers union, as all these criminals do. And he actually survived an attempt on his life on a golf course, El Pilato, in 1981. Yeah, he was golfing on the 8th hole at the Lincolnshire Country Club in Crete. He was on the 8th hole, and a gunman came out of the woods and shot him a bunch of times. He survived.
So he got hit.
He got hit in the arm, and I think the leg or something.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it was a very sloppy hit.
And they know who
they found out, and the shooter was found in a ditch like a month later.
Wow.
Yeah, right. But El Pilato was the boss of Chicago Heights, and he had a bunch of guys under him, and Tootsie Palermo worked for El Pilato. El Pilato worked for Tony Accardo.
I mean, thinking about a place like Mokena,
Mm-hmm.
There was a lot of stories of during Prohibition of people passing through.
Mm-hmm.
The law stopping, crates of booze coming through different times.
Yeah.
There wasn't a mafia presence or a leader,
No.
So was
no.
that limited to Cook County? To why? Where was that limited to? Or
Joliet had a crew. A guy by the name of Francis Curry kind of ran the rackets in Joliet.
Okay.
And so, but I never heard of any Mokena business owners being extorted for money, protection money.
Yeah.
The Prohibition stuff kind of makes sense because the old bootlegging route from the city to Joliet, Mokena was near it. It was like Archer Avenue.
Archer, right, yeah.
Archer Avenue goes all the way to Joliet from the city.
Perfect.
So yeah, I think there was there was some booze raids in Mokena. I think the state bank was robbed back in the 30s.
And Joliet makes sense. Yeah, you're right.
Uh-huh.
Joliet makes sense that there would have been a organized crime presence there.
The mob's tentacles, from Prohibition to modern era, their tentacles reached out to as many towns as they could. I think once you got further away from Chicago, it was harder to corrupt the local governments in some of these towns. Or they were just like, oh no, we can't.
Harder to influence.
Mokena Mokena been like, don't bother. They're too small of a town. There's a good story about Prohibition agents used to fly over in the wintertime. Prohibition agents would fly over like cities like Chicago and into Chicago Heights, and they would look for tops of buildings that the snow was melted because that would probably there was like illegal alcohol being made in that building. So So there's a story about bootleggers would actually go on top of the building where the brewery is and paint it white. Paint it white so it still looked like it had snow on it.
It was a constant cat and mouse, one step in front of the other one, right?
Yeah.
Like, you got to be, the cops had to be one step in front of the bootleggers.
And they always were, like, all the where we're about to go, all the taverns and gambling houses, they were raided all the time.
Huh.
And they were raided by the same cops that were being paid off by these gangsters. I think it was just they had to show that they were doing their job.
Sure.
You know.
But not too good.
Not too good. So yeah, we're going up to Dominic Palermo. He once ran a tavern gambling joint near the Calumet City Sin Strip.
And do you know how long that place was running?
There is a article from St. Louis that mentions a murder of a newspaper woman, and that he might have had something to do with it. In the same article, it has his name, and it says that he's a tavern operator, and that was like 1957. And the Cal City Strip, its heyday was like the early 50s to 70s, and other articles mention this location, and it was a place called the Place Club, is what the Tribune articles say his place that he ran was.
It's the place.
The Place Club. Chicago Heights had a little strip, but I think they mostly focused Calumet City.
Chicago, was it Chicago Road in Chicago Heights was the big
thoroughfare.
A lot of bars and things in the time.
Yeah. And some early gangsters of the Prohibition lived off of. There's a famous picture of Al Capone and a bunch of guys, a little girl and a dog taken off of Chicago Road in Chicago Heights. And it's right in here.
This lot here?
Yeah, in this lot.
So this was
293.
The Place.
The Place.
And now the
293 Torrance Avenue.
It's just a gravel road.
It's just a gravel road now. The Place Club. The Place Club. So obviously we're at an empty lot, but this is where his building used to be. If you look for the address, if you look up the address, and it pinpoints to this lot. And he probably had a bunch of roulette wheels in here, a main bar, probably some ladies that were available upstairs. And look at this building across from here.
Yeah,
that looks old.
Yeah,
that was probably here at the time.
Sure, you can still see a couple that look like they might have been.
Yeah, part of it
back in the day.
That
but a lot
survived.
of empty lots. And all right, so we are gonna go cruise the infamous Calumet City Sin Strip.
Yes.
Or what's left of it.
What's left? Yeah, exactly.
So people were, back in the day, coming from all over the area.
Yeah.
Flooding to downtown Calumet City.
Yeah. Like a lot of some of the bars that used to be here were partly owned by big time gangsters in the city. So sometimes there's photographs of like head mob bosses, Paul the Waiter, Rika, Tony Accardo.
Paul the Waiter.
That's
gotta be one of the worst. I mean,
yeah,
you just made it as a waiter.
Yeah, Paul the Waiter, and and he got that nickname because he was a maitre d' at a restaurant. That's how he met all the big time mobsters.
So never forget.
A lot of these guys fled and came out here because it was a pretty, and they could gamble out here too. It was like, do we go to Cicero and go to a bunch of bars with gambling? Oh, let's go to Cal City. They got something out there too, All right, so this is actually the old strip. So maybe on the right here, all of this empty space used to be taverns and all kinds of gambling houses and stuff. A lot of clubs over here. apparently it was just nothing but bars here back in, you know, the 50s to the...
So this couple short blocks of grass fields
is very infamous. Yeah.
Is what we're talking about.
Very infamous. Gambling mecca of Calumet City, run by the mob. They made a lot of money in that 2 to 3 block radius, that's for sure. Oh, state line. So that's Indiana. Yep.
Which
technically
also,
that's Indiana over there.
Yeah. State line road is the divider.
I think we're in Indiana right now.
Creates a legal kind of protection too, right?
Yeah. So back in Prohibition era days, before Al Capone was a guy named Johnny Torrio, and Johnny Torrio set up some, you know, bordellos in Burnham, Indiana, which is near here, just over the state line. Well, no, Burnham. At the time, it was still in Illinois, but if they were subject to a police raid, they would just cross. They get in their cars and cross the border, and they were fine. Here, different angle too. You know, there was stuff on this side too. These are all probably built in, I don't know, 80s.
Yeah, but you know, just steel buildings.
Yeah,
nothing.
But this is where they all came and partied if they wanted to get out of the city.
You know, I mean, it's wild to think about so much activity on those couple blocks.
Yeah.
And it's just gone. It's just...
totally. I would love to see some old photos like of the area and just kind of line up stuff. So we're going to go to the Taste of Italy now?
Yeah, okay. And Taste of Italy, we'll share more when we get there.
Yeah.
It's kind of the beginning of the end for Tootsie, right?
Yes. Apparently there's a Tribune article about the FBI setting bugging this restaurant because they knew that Tootsie and his underlings, other members of the Chicago Heights crime family, would go there. It was just a place to go and eat, you know, just like any other place. So naturally, the FBI wanted to set up a bug there. So they set up the bug in like 1986-ish. 85, 86.
It's cool to imagine, like,
look at this area.
All the old cars that would have been cruising up and down at the time, and what was...
Yeah, that's what I think about all the time when I trace this history, because all the, like, if you're around a lot of old buildings, you know those were there during the day.
Yeah.
And then you look around and you're like, okay, what's different? Cars, make it right. Yeah, make it right. Cars, the way people dress.
For sure.
What else? You know, there wasn't a McDonald's over there or something.
Well, that's a big thing. I mean, going out to eat was a different experience. Going to a bar or a restaurant, you know, it was a different experience.
Yeah.
It's funny. I just saw, you know, old style bar sign back there. It said slots and, you know, cocktails. And I'm like, you couldn't put that up back in Tootsie's day, could you?
No, yeah. All the slot machines back in his day, all the slot machines were owned by the mob. So they put their slot machines in bars everywhere. And they'd have an underling, some guy that's trying to raise the ranks in the mob, go and collect all the quarters for the mob from all these taverns. Oh, you can see the sign. Yeah, the FBI wiretapped Dominic Palermo here in 1986. They chose this location because it was known that a lot of mob guys met here for meetings and stuff. So they kind of gathered that intelligence and broke into here one night and installed 2 bugs, one underneath a table and one in the ceiling above a table, favored by Palermo and his underlings. And ultimately, they got hundreds of hours of conversation about the inner workings of the Chicago Heights street crew, even the Chicago outfit workings in general, which is all gambling profits. So they got a lot a lot of recorded conversations about really illegal stuff here.
Do you know who was the owner of this building?
I do not.
They
But
just used it as a place they'd meet frequently.
Yeah, in the paper it says that they would mob guys would meet here after the place closed. So I'm sure they were really really friendly with the owner.
Yeah.
And they
sure.
probably spent a lot of money here. But yeah, it says that the FBI waited for it to be closed and made sure no cars were here, and they went in one of these doors here and planted the bug, and it worked, and pretty much was the start of the downfall of Tootsie Palermo and his crew.
It was basically the person over him, his wife, gave him up, right?
Yeah. So this happened here, and then Tootsie's partner, or I guess he might have been the boss of Chicago Heights, was a guy named Al Taco, and Al Taco's wife ultimately testified against him and implicated Tootsie in the Tony Spilotro and Michael Spilotro burial.
So before you, because they throw that out there, but that is
that's
the huge connection to what most people would know about the Dominic Palermo story, right?
Pretty much, yeah.
So, all right, go ahead, say that part.
Yeah, so the Spilotro brothers, everyone knows Tony Spilotro and his brother Michael Spilotro were found buried in an Indiana cornfield in 1986.
From the movie
Casino. From the movie Casino, the famous scene of them in the cornfield, and they get beat up and thrown in a grave.
By Joe Pesci.
Yeah, Joe Pesci famously portrays Tony Spilotro. Now, Dominic Palermo and his little crew, according to Betty Taco's statements, they were in charge of the burial, not the killing of the brothers, but the burial. And they famously botched it. So the brothers were found really quick after they were buried by the farmer that owned the land. And according to Betty Taco's statement, Palermo and Al Taco, Betty's husband, were in charge of the burial, and she pretty much, it was huge that she testified against her husband, because it sent a lot of these guys, including Tootsie, to jail.
Yeah.
And that was 86. That was the same year they bugged this place. So I'm sure 86 to 87 was not a good couple years for Tootsie's crew.
Yeah. And that essentially, down the line, really brought down organized crime in the South Suburbs? Pretty
much, yeah. It decimated it totally. Just because at the time, the crew was already small. Chicago outfit wasn't as large as it once was. So, like, if there was a crew from Chicago out here, it was even smaller. So that pretty much decimated it.
And with the addition of, gambling changing, all those things we talked about.
Yeah.
Demographics, it changed what they could do. People were less intimidated.
Yes, 100%. Even like with surveillance, technology, like they couldn't just operate in the shadows anymore. They were pretty much cut at the waist, as far as illegally making money.
So from this, they end up, Tootsie ends up getting arrested.
Ends up getting arrested. He was 1992 is when he officially went to jail, and they started really looking at him in 1989 and building a case against Tootsie.
So at that point, does anybody take over for him that we know of?
He's pretty much the last, because he was boss of Heights after El Taco went to jail, and that was only for a couple years. Tootsie was boss, and then he went to jail, and that he was pretty much the last guy standing to run the Chicago Heights branch of the outfit. Yeah.
Man, how many people were they cramming in this little joint?
I don't know. Yeah, I mean,
neat place. Yeah, too bad. It would be neat to be able to walk through those doors again.
yeah.
So, okay, so the picture of Tootsie is at the picnic table surrounded by a really cool black and white old photo.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So that's another really, really interesting photo that floats around. And it looks like it's just like a cookout with all these guys. And Tony Accardo is definitely the most fascinating person in that photo because he's at the head of the picnic table and he's the boss. He's the boss of the outfit. And a lot of other higher up guys are in that photo, like Jackie the Lackey Cerrone. He was a high up guy in that picture. Tootsie, I think, is believed to be in that photo. What's interesting about that photo is there's a box of beer on the picnic table, and the brand is the brand that Tony Accardo sold. Beer. Like he was a on paper he was a beer salesman.
Okay.
You know, on paper, and he was a Foxhead Beer is the company that he sold beer for, and there's a box of Foxhead Beer on the picnic table, which is kind of funny.
Cool.
Yeah, but they're all smiling, having a cookout. It's funny when these guys got their pictures taken. Obviously, these guys didn't like their pictures taken a lot, but the real intimate ones like that, and where we're about to go, you know, those are okay. And all the real famous photos of the outfit gathered in one space were all found in people's homes.
Really?
You know, like the cops on a raid found the infamous Last Supper photo. There's an outfit picture. It's called the Last Supper photo, and it's all a bunch of guys, all a bunch of higher ups at this table, including Al Pilato and stuff. There were times when these guys were like, "Yeah, take our photo." You know, we know it's going in your living room, in your like family album book, friends album book, or whatever. They never knew that any of these photos would get resurfaced.
And how would they ever imagine, you know, that, let alone be sent around to the world on the internet,
right,
you know, years later? One of the articles that I was reading about Taco's wife and him turning on her, she was saying, I had no clue all this time that they're married that he was part of organized crime.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden it was like, oh, you know, she came Taco came and told his wife something about
the Spilotros.
This, and the murder, and all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, he was part of a murder,
right? And
that was like,
it's gone too far.
Triggered.
I've read that El Taco was a sausage maker. Maybe he had like a butcher shop. He also, I think, had a auto parts business, but in the 80s. In Chicago Heights, there was something called the Chop Shop Wars. So a lot of connected guys wound up dead. They were chopping cars. You know, they were big auto thieves. Taco was an auto thief. They would steal cars, bring it to a shop that they knew of, and they'd have them chop it up to sell the parts. And a lot of guys died during this time. The Chop Shop Wars. It was in the 80s. And El Taco, that was big business for the mob, because they were selling car parts illegally and making money that way. And all these guys had a front. You know, maybe Taco was a sausage maker. Or, you know, maybe he just had a lot of these guys had legitimate businesses that they funneled their money through. So he had a front. Yeah, he had a front, just like Tootsie owned a bar. You know, that was
it just seems, and now in our time, a little far-fetched to think that a spouse could go that many years, but then who knows? You think about that era and that time, and
they were quiet.
Sure.
This is another example of how these guys didn't attract attention, but how they kept all this stuff from their families. It's mind-boggling.
Yeah.
You know?
And for her then to realize, oh, hey, my husband's a major figure in the Mafia, and I'm going to go rat him out.
Yeah. It was huge news when it happened. It was I think it was the only time it ever happened in the history of either organized crime, that being New York, or Chicago. It's definitely the first time in Chicago that a gangster's wife ratted on him. Yeah. So he went to jail for that, and that's when Tootsie took over as boss of the South Suburbs.
And did Tootsie have any kids?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I haven't really read anything about it.
Not listed on the headstone or anything?
No. It's just him and his wife. There's no like extra plots or anything.
Yeah.
And my research on Tootsie is mostly the newspaper archives, and if you Google search him, there's not that much like private info about him.
It is funny. It jumps. We talked about. Was it 1956 was kind of the first time we hear about him.
57, there was that,
the newspaper woman
in the newspapers, but
and then it jumps around. Like I think it was like 60 something, and then late 70s,
and then and then late 80s into the early 90s. He's mentioned all the time because he was getting indicted for extortion. So the newspapers like to write about all that.
Yeah.
We are headed north on Chicago Road in South Chicago Heights. This area of Chicago Heights was a big Italian enclave, around the turn of the century. So this is the heavy Italian area.
And they were, as we said, they were very connected. Chicago Heights, and all the way through to South Holland, as far as organized crime was.
These guys originally fell under the fold of the Capone gang. So they made sure to make friends with Al Capone early on.
You still see some of these small pubs and bars.
Yeah, that building was probably 1880s, 90s.
Yeah, I mean, this still has a lot of what probably, Calumet City tore down.
Right, 100%. So there's a famous photo of Al Capone and a bunch of his employees, and a little girl and a dog. And all the research me and some of my fellow historians have done puts it right here. It's a famous photo. They're all sitting around getting a nice picture. And in the photo, there are three prominent Chicago Heights mobsters.
And before we get into that, you talk about how you kind of think why you thought that was the area. But these houses sort of show up in the background.
Yeah.
And you're able to identify where the property would have sat at the time.
Yeah, so in the old photo, if you zoom in, all the way in the back, you see a couple of houses. And they kind of look similar to those ones. So I kind of pinpointed where this photo was taken by those houses. And all the research I've done puts it at this corner of 26th Street in Chicago Road. But there was it shows like maybe these two houses here were in the background, and the photographer was taking a picture of them going from south.
So then we'd be where this gas station is now.
Yeah, so I think where the gas station is where the house of Jimmy Emery was. Jimmy Emery is in the photo, laying down to the right. He owned a house that used to be where this gas station is, back in the 20s, and it was kind of made up of two families. Two heads of the Chicago Heights criminal organization lived here. And this photo represents Al Capone coming out with a bunch of his bodyguards, and having probably just a day trip to visit them, because they already made a connection during Prohibition. So they were probably just coming out here to visit. Some people think that it was early planning for the St. Valentine's Day Massacre.
Oh.
Because it was taken in 1928.
Another really cool house across the street.
Yeah, there's some cool houses around here. Yeah, so in the photograph, there's Frank Laporte is in the photograph. He's to the left of Al Capone, and Jimmy Emery is to the right, laying down of Al Capone. And those two guys ran Chicago Heights up into the late 30s. So they kind of started in the mid 20s to the late 30s, and Jimmy Emery, whose house it was, kind of moved to Miami, Florida later on. But Frank Laporte, that's in the photo, he ran Chicago Heights up until his death in 1972.
Oh, wow. And any other time that it was believed or known that Capone visited the area?
This is the most solid evidence of the time that he came out here, was this kind of meeting. But I'm sure he visited the Cal City Strip, the Sin Strip in Calumet City. He probably visited that. Well, it's hard to say because Capone went to jail in 1931. So it's hard to say where else he went in Chicago Heights. But we do know that he was at that house on the corner of 26th Street and Chicago Road.
Well, Chicago Heights still, as we said, holds a lot of these old buildings. And when you drive through the neighborhoods, the homes, there's amazing, beautiful homes that have been built, that were built back in the day that are still standing. I'm sure nowhere near the condition they were back then, but just really incredible to see.
Yeah. Good end to the tour today.
Yeah.
Our main subject, Dominic Tootsie Palermo, ended up here in St. John Cemetery.
And as you said, his wife passed away, was it 2017?
2017, yeah.
And so they're both buried here together. And as far as we know, no real connection to St. John's or Mokena otherwise, right?
No.
Okay, so here we are at St. John's
Cemetery.
It's a little rainy, but...
And who's this in front of us?
Here we are.
Dominic Tootsie Palermo's final resting place, along with his wife, Betty.
Pretty good picture. Probably one of the best pictures we've been able to find.
The only one of him smiling I've seen.
Yeah. And then his
wife.
wife here. And then we talked a little bit about, while we were driving, about if he had kids. And the stone here says married 50 years, together forever, father and Poppy.
Poppy could be grandfatherly name, or they could have had kids, but on the back here is interesting.
Missed by our family: Penny, Tammy, Dominic, Lauren, Mariah, Z, and Cameron.
So that could be, I mean, it's kind of doesn't really tell you, but yeah.
You'd assume kids and grandkids.
The cold case of, we still don't know how he ended up here. I mean, he was in jail from, the early 90s until he died in 2005. He died in jail. Please let us know if you have any information on why and he might be buried here.
No, really interesting, and a really interesting story. Thank you for reaching out to me. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
And learning a little bit about kind of the South, Cook, Indiana
Suburban gangland.
Mafia, as well as kind of how Mokena gets tied in and connected here. So
exactly.
A lot of great information. Tell people how they can find your Instagram.
So if you follow me on Instagram at Chicago_gangland_history, Chicago Gangland History, it'll pop up. And you can follow me for other stories about guys like this on other different towns. I'm also offering private tours in my car that you can message me about if interested.
All right, we're gonna start getting wet here, so thanks again.
All right, thank you, Israel. Yeah.